The main character in this story is a young man named Kazuya. On his way to the supermarket to buy food, he sees many people panicking and running out. It turns out that the supermarket is being attacked by a robber, causing everyone to flee in fear. However, there are two girls too scared to run and are just holding on to each other. Seeing the robber approach, Kazuya bravely sacrifices himself to protect them. As a result, the two girls survive, but Kazuya is severely injured and dies shortly after. All he can hear in his mind are the cries of the people around him. Kazuya thinks it's all over, but his heroic act causes him to reincarnate into the body of a boy named Ken. After lying in bed for a week due to a fever, Ken finally wakes up. The housemaid is very happy, and his mother comes to provide warmth, checking if Ken still recognizes her. Ken is extremely shocked and can't believe that he has turned into a small child. Because Ken had been bedridden for a week, he was very hungry. His mother and the housemaid quickly go to prepare food. As Ken calms down, he realizes that he has reincarnated into a completely different world, and perhaps the two girls he saved are now safe. However, his new small body makes him feel awkward. Ken is the youngest child in a wealthy family, so he is very spoiled. All his needs for food and rest are always taken care of by the cute and attentive maid. Ken's father is a nobleman named Graham, who leads a troop and owns a forest filled with magical creatures. Graham has two wives, with Ken's mother being the second wife, while the first wife, Maria, has two sons named Jin and Alex. Ken also has an older sister named Riani. Ken's family is very surprised to see that Ken, who just woke up, can already write and do arithmetic. Ken even expresses his desire to learn everything about this world, including history and magic. Ken's father is very proud to have such an extraordinary child. However, his older sister thinks Ken is still too young and should wait until he is old enough to undergo the baptism ceremony before learning and using magic. Despite this, Ken can use magic without needing to study from books, even almost burning the house down because he can't control it. Ken has to hide his power from those around him. His older sister, Riani, knows that Ken is very eager to explore the outside world. Every day, she teaches Ken about the history of the world, like how an adventurer founded this kingdom and became the first king. This world is also inhabited by various races such as elves, beastmen, and dwarves. 2 years pass, and Ken, now 5 years old, is preparing for the baptism ceremony. His family is very happy to see Ken growing up. After the baptism ceremony, Ken's family holds a party to celebrate. Ken's father reminds him to open his magic status for everyone to see. Ken, thinking he had hidden it, confidently reveals his status. Ken's family is shocked to see that all of Ken's attributes are very high, even having many blessings from the gods. Ken's father is very worried and warns Ken not to reveal his status to anyone because his power could threaten the country and attract the kingdom's attention. Nevertheless, Ken remains cheerful and curious to try out his powers. Ken takes a summoning book to test his blessings. He tries to summon a small animal, but a large monster appears instead. Riani and a beastman girl are very frightened. This situation reminds Ken of when he saved the two girls in the supermarket, so he doesn't hesitate to use his magic to defeat the monster. After succeeding, Ken collapses and the two girls think he is dead. However, Ken soon gets up and his wounds heal completely. Ken apologizes to Riani, who is very worried and feels happy that in this world, he can also save people. The next day, Ken is introduced to other family members. In front of everyone, Ken declares his desire to become an adventurer to explore the world, make friends, and help people. His father decides to hire tutors to teach him. Ken is very excited to see who his tutors are. When they arrive, Ken is very happy to welcome them. The two tutors are young and beautiful girls, a shy red-haired girl named Millie and a green-haired elf named Nina. Their task is to train Ken for the next 5 years. The first lesson taught is swordsmanship. Despite being small, Ken's swordsmanship skills are extraordinary, even matching Millie's. Nina, a high-level magician, is also amazed to see Ken using magic without incantations. Ken continues to hide his power from those around him but remains enthusiastic about learning and exploring his new world. Nina and Millie are very surprised by these events. They feel there is no need to teach Ken anymore as he is now considered a genius. Seeing his two tutors looking despondent, Ken invites them outside for extracurricular training. Since the baptism ceremony, Ken has never left the castle. However, before that, they need to get permission from Ken's father. Hearing the request, his father agrees on the condition that they must return before sunset. Once outside, Ken is very happy to see how beautiful and full of adventure the world outside the castle is. They stop at a large rock to train. With a bit of magic, Ken makes the rock evaporate, destroying a vast area around it without feeling tired. His two tutors are even more surprised by Ken's power. However, they sense something approaching. It turns out to be a killer rabbit, a dangerous monster that attacks humans. The monster ignores the two girls and heads straight for Ken. Easily, Ken dodges and uses wind magic to defeat the rabbit. Ken puts the rabbit in an item box to show his sister. Seeing the interesting item box, Millie also wants to buy an item pouch when she has enough money. Since it is still daylight, Millie suggests they hunt a few more monsters. Using magic to search for monsters, they find many rabbits from a distance. Even though it's Ken's first time doing it, they are no longer surprised by his ability. They manage to defeat many killer rabbits. When about to chase one that runs into the forest, Millie stops them because the forest has many dangerous monsters. Ken is determined to become an adventurer to protect the people. That night, Ken is very surprised that just by defeating a few rabbits, his level has risen several levels. He feels that the gods are giving him more power even though he only wants to be an ordinary adventurer. The next day, his two tutors take him to the Adventurers Guild to accept quests. Ken is very happy as he will become a real adventurer. Millie asks the receptionist to find another monster for Ken to practice on. At that moment, an adventurer comes and forces Millie to invite him for a drink because he is more senior. However, Millie refuses, saying they are busy. The adventurer gets angry and tries to grab the two girls. Ken asks them to stop, but they ignore him. Ken easily defeats the adventurer. Although angry, the adventurer cannot fight back and eventually attacks Ken with a sword. Ken dodges and gives him a chance to apologize, but the adventurer remains stubborn, so Ken throws him out of the guild. After that, Nina hugged Ken and felt emotional because he didn't leave her. They headed to the forest to continue their magic training. Time passed, and Ken became a teenager. Before parting ways, Ken wanted to give a meaningful gift to his two teachers. He made magic pouches from materials he found in the forest. When the soldiers saw the forest changing, they thought they were being attacked by monsters and sounded the alarm. However, there was only a big hole without any monsters. Ken's father soon realized that this was his son's doing. The next day, they went monster hunting again. Ken thanked his teachers for the lessons over the past year and gave them his handmade magic pouches. The two girls were surprised that the pouches could hold so many items. They considered the pouches a national treasure and worried they might be stolen, but Ken assured them that the pouches would protect themselves. His two teachers gave Ken farewell kisses and promised to come whenever he needed them. Ken's journey as an adventurer continued. He kept training his powers, defeating various monsters, and growing stronger. At 16, Ken headed to the capital to attend a royal family event. On the way, he sensed monsters attacking the group. Ken quickly intervened and defeated the monsters. The soldiers who witnessed his strength were worried, but Ken introduced himself as the third son of a noble. After resolving all the issues, the carriage door suddenly opened, causing Ken and his father to kneel. Inside the carriage were the princess and a noble's daughter. They immediately thanked Ken and his father for their help. However, the princess was still traumatized after being attacked by monsters, so Ken asked for permission to use magic to calm her mind. Thanks to Ken's magic, all their worries and fatigue vanished, making the two girls feel light as feathers and fall in love with Ken. The two girls quickly changed the way they addressed Ken and began competing for his attention as if they all wanted Ken to be theirs. When they learned that Ken was also heading to the capital, the two girls insisted that Ken ride with them in the carriage. Ken's father could only kneel without saying a word. Inside the carriage, despite there being plenty of space, the two girls sat very close to Ken, so even if he wanted to move, they wouldn't allow it. At that moment, the two girls suggested they call each other by name to become more familiar. The princess was named Tara and the noble's daughter was named Silk. Ken didn't dare refuse, so he finally agreed, albeit nervously. After that, a soldier informed Ken that they would soon arrive in the city of Renoma, where they would rest before continuing to the capital the next morning. Ken thought that once they arrived, everyone would go to their own homes. But the two girls clung to Ken and insisted on sleeping together. Ken's father said that Ken was still too young, but the two girls argued that they wanted Ken to protect them at all times, making Ken's father relent. So, he reminded Ken to take care of his health and not to get too wild. When they entered the room, 3 beds were arranged very close to each other. But because it wasn't close enough, they pushed the beds even closer and forced Ken to sleep in the middle. Then, the two girls invited Ken to do some exercises before bed, claiming they were afraid of monster attacks and wanted to be closer to Ken. Ken finally agreed after refusing several times. As a result, Ken didn't sleep at all that night. When they resumed their journey in the morning, Ken's eyes were darker than a panda's, and the following nights, he couldn't sleep well because of the two girls. After several days of traveling, they finally arrived in the capital. At the palace, the two girls continued to stick to Ken enthusiastically. The person who welcomed them was the deputy captain of the Royal Knights, Gadzak, who thanked Ken for protecting the princess and bringing the fallen soldiers back to the capital. Ken said that everyone fought very bravely against the monsters, so Gadzak promised to reward them and deliver messages to their families. However, the most credit went to Ken, so Gadzak asked Ken to meet the king. Ken was brought to the palace, and when people learned that Ken was just a child, they all stared at him. However, when he met the king highly praised Ken for saving the princess and the noble's daughter on his own. Ken was given a noble title, a silver coin reward, and a large house. Some members of the royal family were envious of young Ken. One even dared to argue with the king, but when the king asked if he knew how to kill monsters, he fell silent. Ken accepted the rewards but wasn't allowed to leave yet. He had to go to the royal reception room with the two young girls. In the royal reception room, the king thanked Ken for saving the princess. The father of the noble's daughter also expressed his gratitude, making Ken feel a bit awkward. They had a request. They wanted to betroth Ken to the two girls so that in the future, they could officially marry because Ken had taken such good care of them. Even sleeping together, Ken felt that he hadn't even gained anything that night, but he found this interesting and pleasant, so he agreed. To fund the crafting business, Ken gave 1 gold coin to the guest, who was a craftsman. Ken then said goodbye to the guest and went outside. Outside, Ken saw his brother very angry because Ken had run off without his knowledge. Ken had to appease his brother by looking at the clothes he had bought. The next morning, Ken received news from a servant that the craftsman had invited Ken to his shop. When he arrived, Ken was very surprised because the craftsman had made a very fine chessboard. Ken then played chess with Panmer, and seeing them play well, the craftsman felt that the game would become very popular. Ken suggested the craftsman make 2 types of chessboards, one for nobles and one for commoners, each with a different price. Ken suggested producing more than 100 chessboards first and, if needed, producing more. However, the craftsman complained about lacking funds. Ken then threw another gold coin, and the craftsman was very happy and determined to work hard. But before that, they had to make an agreement and present the chessboard to the god of agriculture for approval. After the craftsman finished his oath, the chessboard was offered to the god of agriculture as a sign that the agreement was complete. Ken also didn't forget to ask the craftsman to make a luxurious chess set to be given to the king. At that time, the gods were very happy with Ken's new toy. Ken then went home and remembered that he had forgotten to attend the royal matchmaking event. Since Ken had become a noble, his father said this event would be very important. However, Ken was very confident that this time he would handle the situation well, surprising his father, who didn't expect Ken to be just a child. Ken's family then went to the royal matchmaking party. Ken immediately recognized the nobleman who had opposed him earlier, along with the 2 children who weren't much different from him. Ken also reunited with the nobleman's daughter and her father. Since he hadn't had the chance to introduce himself before, Ken carefully greeted them this time. However, the nobleman's father still remembered that Ken had made his daughter cry, so he showed an expression that frightened Ken. The nobleman's daughter then introduced herself by her full name, and Ken complimented her beautiful dress, making her very happy. Her father saw that Ken was still young but already skilled at charming girls, prompting Ken's father to quickly explain that Ken was used to complimenting his sister and thus praised anyone he met. At that moment, the royal family appeared before the nobles, and after the king gave a speech, they all raised their glasses for a toast. When it was Ken's family's turn to greet the king, Ken once again praised the princess, likening her to a goddess, which made the princess very pleased. The king was speechless because the nobleman had raised a child like Ken. Ken then presented the king with a chessboard that he and a craftsman had made. But the king still remembered Ken's earlier praise and ordered Ken to meet him in the drawing room after the party for further discussion. Ken's father praised Ken for being able to make toys to earn money and left Ken to mingle with other guests. At that moment, the nobleman's daughter came over and invited Ken to a more private place. Having not been near the canal for a long time, she used this opportunity to invite Ken to eat. While getting ready, a few nobles came over to greet them, making her very upset and not wanting to talk to them. According to royal etiquette, she still had to greet these 3 nobles, but they considered Ken's family of low status and unworthy of associating with them. However, Ken wasn't afraid of them and forced them to apologize for making the nobleman's daughter uncomfortable. Their leader refused to accept this and challenged Ken to a fight outside. When they got there, the nobleman's daughter clung to Ken, further angering the nobles. Their leader threatened that his 2 subordinates were protected by gods and could use magic, but because they hadn't practiced, they forgot how to use it. When they finally chanted spells, they could only summon small lightning bolts that looked impressive but produced tiny flames, making Ken and the nobleman's daughter laugh. The second subordinate also chanted the same spell but could only throw a few small stones. The nobleman's daughter, now very annoyed, ordered them to stop and revealed that Ken had been granted the title of Baron by the king, making them terrified and apologized before leaving in shame. After they left, the nobleman's daughter invited Ken on a date, but just then, the princess arrived, and Ken had to stop the nobleman's daughter from speaking further. Knowing that these 2 were going on a date, the princess became very jealous. To appease her, Ken complimented her beauty and promised to date her another time. However, the king was already behind the princess and caught Ken inviting his daughter on a date. The king invited Ken to the drawing room to talk. Both fathers knew that Ken was skilled at charming their daughters, so they didn't need to scare him. The next day, Ken was given the key to his private mansion. Upon arrival, the king wanted to play chess with him, but everyone stopped him. Ken planned to go home, but Silk's father brought a chessboard to invite him to play again. Many officials lined up to play with him. After finishing, Ken went to the mansion, which turned out to be very old. When Ken opened the door, there was dust and cobwebs everywhere. However, with magic, Ken cleaned everything, making the mansion look brand new. Ken was very happy to see his new home. Ken's loyal servant, Sylvia, brought a butler and many other servants to take care of the mansion. The new butler greatly admired Ken after hearing about his achievements. The servants started cleaning the mansion, but everything had already been done by Ken's magic, so they only needed to arrange the furniture. The butler reminded Ken to visit home because his siblings were there. They greatly admired Ken for earning the Baron title at a young age. Ken's sister wanted to see his new mansion. After showing the mansion, Ken's father wasn't satisfied and wanted artwork hanging in the house. Ken showed that he had already prepared everything, and when they went downstairs, the family was surprised to see a fire dragon statue. Ken's father asked where he got it, and Ken admitted that he killed the dragon last year. His father could only tell Ken to explain to the people around him so they wouldn't be afraid. Realizing that placing the dragon there was a good idea, they continued the house tour. Ken's bathroom surprised his mother with its feature that sprayed water upwards, making it very comfortable. Ken's father couldn't believe it and tried it himself, feeling the same. He asked Ken to design such bathrooms throughout the house. After that, Ken's father reminded them that they needed to hold a party to celebrate the new house with the nobles. The butler quickly prepared a guest list, but there was the name of an evil nobleman that made Ken worried. Sylvia encouraged Ken to be friendly. Ken didn't dare invite the king because of his highest position in the country. The next day, Ken and the servants prepared gifts for the guests, as well as food and drinks like meat and wine. Sylvia tasted the food and drinks, finding everything delicious. Since Ken was still young and couldn't drink wine, he asked Sylvia to try it. Sylvia drank a whole bottle and wanted more. Just then, Ken received a call from the king. The king was angry for not receiving an invitation, even though he was Ken's father-in-law. Fortunately, Ken had already prepared an invitation. The king was very happy and showed it off to everyone. Ken's servants were surprised that Ken managed to invite the king. Ken admitted that he had already been recognized as a son-in-law by the king. That night, the new house opening party began. The first guests were Silk's father and daughter, who were captivated by the dragon statue. The butler reminded Ken to greet the other guests. After Ken's announcement, the guests raised their glasses to celebrate, praising the wine and food served. Eric praised Ken as the conqueror of girls' appetites. The royal family arrived late, but the king asked everyone to enjoy the party. After tasting the wine and food, the king was very impressed and praised Ken in front of many nobles. The evil nobleman arrived late, looking arrogant, but was terrified to see the dragon statue. Ken explained that it was just a statue, and the party continued successfully. This person had just dared to enter the mansion to eat, and the other nobles could only remain silent. But this person drank the best wine and still dared to criticize, talking about the hamburgers he kept eating but still criticizing their bad taste, making people very upset. However, because of his position as a marquis, people still had to be patient. After that, he was given a few glasses as gifts for those who came to congratulate him. But this person asked for dozens of glasses and also asked for the recipes for the dishes and wine making. However, because this person was too greedy, the king immediately appeared and told him that all that was left was a belt. Not believing that a marquis like him could be so greedy and arrogant, the king threatened that if he continued like that, he would be fired. The person was terrified and retreated with a very pained look. The princess saw this and knew that everything had been arranged to trap the marquis, and the king, hearing this, then punished Ken for daring to take advantage of him. The next morning, Ken went to the deputy head of the guards to ask for his help. It turned out that Ken wanted to sell materials from the monsters he had hunted. The deputy head took him to a room for storing monsters, but he said it was too small because the monsters Ken hunted were large, like earth dragons. The deputy's head was shocked because these were monsters that only a-level adventurers could defeat, so he went out with the deputy's head to show off his hunting results. Seeing these monsters, the deputy head could only remain silent. He asked if Ken was a hero or a messenger of the gods because ordinary people couldn't be that great. Seeing Ken leave, the deputy head invited him to watch the knights training, and the captain was also eager to meet Ken because he had heard that Ken was very strong. After that, the deputy head introduced Ken to the royal knights. Some people saw that Ken was still young and considered him a child. So, the deputy head arranged for them to spar, and within seconds, Ken had knocked his opponent's wooden sword away, making the person surrender immediately. Ken did not want to fight anymore, but the deputy head asked him to try fighting again. However, before the battle began, the captain called everyone to stop. He jumped down and scolded the knights for shamelessly bothering a small child. Then, he hugged Ken and asked the deputy head why he didn't fight them. But upon hearing that Ken had killed a dragon, he became angry and challenged Ken to a fight. The deputy head suggested that he introduce himself first, but the captain wanted to fight first and introduce himself later. Although Ken was only using a wooden sword, he still fought well against the girl known as the Saint of Swords. Their skills and speed were balanced, impressing the audience even more. The captain was very happy because it had been a long time since he found a balanced opponent. But suddenly, Ken increased his speed, spun behind the captain, and touched him with his sword. The captain was deeply moved and wanted to cry, then suddenly hugged Ken and said he would marry him. However, Ken refused and said he was still too young. The captain then introduced herself as Tefana and a viscount. Since Tefana is an elf who can live up to 500 years, she is not worried about age. But Ken said he needed to ask others for their opinion first. Tefana agreed and wanted to ask the king directly, so she took Ken to meet the king. In front of the king, Tefana said she would marry Ken, leaving the king and Ken's father stunned. Ken then recounted how he defeated Tefana, and she wanted to marry him. His father and the king then explained that Tefana came from Rebel Land, the beautiful land of elves. Although Rebel is part of this kingdom, they still govern themselves like an independent country. If Ken married Tefana, it would be like marrying the princess of another country. However, the king then told Tefana that Ken was already engaged to the princess and another lady, suggesting she think again. But Tefana fell even more in love with Ken and said she would write a letter to her father to ask for permission to marry, leaving everyone speechless. After leaving the palace, the king wondered why Tefana, the kingdom's strongest knight, could be so easily defeated by Ken. Also, Ken easily defeats the dragon and other monsters. Feeling something strange about Ken's power, the king decided to bring the kingdom's magic book to check on him. Since then, every day Tefana invited Ken on dates, but their dates were sword fighting sessions, making Ken very tired. When he thought he could rest, the deputy head brought him to the king. Ken felt the tension around him. The king then asked someone to bring the kingdom's magic book for Ken. The book was written by the first king for humans. Ken was very happy. He opened it and easily read every line about magic in the book, which was written in Japanese. The king immediately asked who Ken was and where he came from. Ken then remembered that the author of the book, the first king, also had a Japanese name, so he was sure that he was also a reincarnated person like him. But before that, Ken had to explain his identity to everyone. In front of everyone, Ken admitted that he had memories from a previous life and he and the first king came from a country called Japan. When he was 15 years old, Ken met a god during his baptism ceremony. Everyone was shocked to hear that he met a god, and they asked Ken to reveal his status for them to see. When Ken revealed his status, everyone was astonished to see very high numbers and the title Apostle of God. The king thought that if Ken had that title, he should be the king of this country, but Ken did not want to. When he first reincarnated here, Ken knew nothing about this world. Thanks to his parents and friends who helped him, Ken could be who he is now. Thanks to meeting the princess and the lady, Ken was given a title by the king, so he was very grateful to his father and apologized to the king for hiding everything. However, Ken just wanted to be himself and did not want to be king. Although Ken had explained, the king did not care and still wanted him to be king. As the tension increased, Tefana entered and showed a marriage permit letter from her father. Tefana asked for permission to take Ken out for a sword fight. The king finally understood everything and hoped that Ken would use his power to protect those closest to him and the people of this kingdom. The story of the marriage had just reached the ears of the princess and the young lady, but before they could ask about it, Ken had already been taken by Captain Tefana on a date. Ken had to explain that this date was just a sword training session. After that, Ken read a book from the first king which recorded that the king was also a Japanese person who was reborn in this world. Unlike Ken, the king remained in his adult form and did not become a child. At that moment, the princess and the young lady came to invite Ken to play, but Ken had to find an excuse to avoid them because there was an important matter to attend to. Just as he escaped from the two girls, Tefana came again and invited Ken to practice outside the next day. Ken apologized to Tefana and promised to train her another time, as that day was Ken's birthday and he would become a true adventurer. Ken went to the Adventurers Guild to register as a beginner. There, he met a strong adventurer named Cloud with red hair. Ken felt he had seen him before. Ken then met the receptionist named Letta to register. After filling out the form, Ken dropped a drop of blood onto a crystal ball to store his magical power in the Adventurers Guild. Ken started as an adventurer with the lowest rank, which was rank G. Ken remembered his two teachers who were once at rank D and wondered where they were now. Letta reminded Ken to always strive and keep his life safe.